Hi, welcome to the very beginning, Begin at the Beginning, Chapter 1. Today what we're going to look at is what is interpersonal communication. Our lecture learning outcomes for this online lecture will be, first of all, to define interpersonal communication. Second, explain what it means to study communication. And third, to draw and explain the model of interpersonal communications with emphasis on identifying the model's components. So that's where we're going to begin today. And in order to do that, it's important to first start to look at what are the characteristics of interpersonal communication. And the first one is that interpersonal communication is inescapable, meaning that you can, if you're going to use a double negative, you cannot not communicate. The very fact that you are alive and that you are present in the world, you are communicating. For example, if I was to come into a face-to-face lecture and I was to walk into the room and just stand in front of the class, but not say anything, am I communicating? Absolutely, because even though I'm not speaking, even though I'm not moving or doing anything, I am communicating to the class. Second, interpersonal communication is irreversible. I know that you can relate to this because I think all of us have done this. Something has come out of our mouth and we've almost wanted to clamp our hand over our mouth and say, shoot, I wish I hadn't said that. And that goes to the nature of interpersonal communication, that it's irreversible. Once something has been said, once something has been done, we can't take it back. Even though there are times in our lives that we would like to, it's irreversible. Once it's out there in the universe, it's out there and it cannot be taken back. The third characteristic is interpersonal communication is unrepeatable. I think we all can remember a time that we had just a fantastic conversation with a friend and thought to ourselves, that was the best conversation. And maybe the next day we saw our friend again and we thought, well, we should have that conversation again. I so enjoyed that. But we can't because we are a different person. Even if the conversation happens an hour later, we're a different person an hour later, as is the person that we're communicating with. So we can never repeat that exact communication event again. So in our journey to understand what is interpersonal communication, we now know that it's inescapable. We cannot not communicate. It's irreversible. We can't take it back once it's put out there. And it's unrepeatable. Try as we might want to, we cannot repeat the communication episode. So also in trying to understand what is interpersonal communication, we can compare it to some different things. If you look on the bottom of the slide, you see that there is a spectrum between impersonal communication and interpersonal communication. We start on the left side, which is impersonal communication, and that occurs when we treat someone as an object or relate to them based on their role. If you see the picture on this slide, it shows a person who is checking out at a grocery store. She is communicating with that grocery clerk just based on her role. Their conversation probably was, how are you today? I'm fine, thank you. Did you find everything okay? Yes, I did. And they just communicated based on their roles as checkout clerk and customer. Now, if we move from that impersonal spectrum on the bottom over to the right side, which is interpersonal, this happens when it's a process of two individuals interacting and mutually influencing each other simultaneously, usually for the management of relationships. So that interpersonal communication is those folks that are important to us. Those are the people that are long-term relationships, our fathers, our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, our boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. So when we look at that spectrum, we can see that we could probably place all of our relationships that we've had today somewhere on that spectrum between impersonal, which occurs when we treat them as objects or relate to them based on their role, or interpersonal, the people who are more important in our lives. I also have on this slide intrapersonal communication. And intrapersonal communication is the communication that happens with yourself as you are communicating with others. Almost think of it as a dialogue that's running in your head, that's kind of telling you, almost narrating what you're seeing or what you're thinking about. It's also known as self-talk. I do want you to pay attention to this because it's very important in how we communicate with others. What we are saying to ourselves as far as what we are experiencing in our world has a huge impact on how then we communicate with others. Okay, so now let's look at, I think we have a pretty good handle on the characteristics of what interpersonal communication includes. I think we now understand the difference between impersonal, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. But now let's look at it more with a wide lens and let's look at communication as a whole. Well, communication is the process of acting on information. So that kind of gives you a large umbrella term. Underneath that is human communication, which is the process of making sense out of the world around us and attempting to share that sense with others. So one of the things that I've included for this online lecture is a video that I'd like you to click on and go out to YouTube and watch. It's very short, and I think you'll find it's pretty funny to watch. It's two 18-month-old twins who are trying very hard and I would argue are communicating. What's interesting about these two twins is that they are not using words. They're babbling back and forth. But as you watch these twins interact, this is the question I want you to ask yourself. Is this communication? Are these twins communicating? Are they making sense out of the world around them? And then are they attempting to share that sense with the other twin? It's very fascinating to watch them because by looking at their nonverbals, not even paying attention to their babbling, it really does appear that they are attempting to share what they're seeing in their world. So what are some of the areas that we can study in the field of communication? Well, all you need to do is open up any community college, tech college, or four-year college class catalog, and you'll see some of the different areas that we can study in communication. We can study mass communication, which occurs when one person sends a message to many people at once. Twitter is a great example of this. Public communication, when a speaker addresses a large audience. If you go to a lecture course, that obviously falls under public communication. Small group communication is communication between 3 to 15 people. A lot of times we see this in a business or industry setting. We also look at business and organizational communication. There are courses specifically addressing the elements and the skills needed to be successful. And then intercultural communication, which occurs between people from two different cultures. We're seeing a lot more emphasis on that whole idea of intercultural communication in our college classrooms. The last thing that I want to talk with you today about is the process of interpersonal communication. I think we have a pretty good understanding of the characteristics. I think we can kind of compare it between impersonal, interpersonal, intrapersonal. I think we can look at the areas, or have looked at the areas of studies, and now it's time to actually look at the model itself. When we look at the model of communication, there are some real obvious elements and some less obvious. The most obvious elements are the communication episode itself, which is actually what is transmitted. We look at the source, who is the person who is encoding or putting together the message. In their head, they're deciding how they're going to share what they want to share. When they do that, it becomes the message. It's sent across a channel. Remember, our channels pretty much follow our 5 senses. We can send a channel through our eyes, through our ears, through our nose, even through smell. So all of those are channels, and we choose the best way. An example of this is if you ever been with someone and you felt empathy or sympathy and you didn't quite know, you couldn't quite encode the right words to say, but instead you just decided to hug that person. Well, what you've done is you've decided to encode your message of sympathy through a nonverbal channel of touch, and you've just decided to give a hug because you couldn't find the right words. So that's channel. The receiver then is the person on the other end who then decodes and makes sense out of the message. Interesting to note here, folks, this is where a lot of our miscommunication or bypassing happens, because the message is not decoded in the exact same way that the source wanted it to be. You know, and sometimes it comes through just different interpretations. So we have to be aware if that happens, that then we look for, and one of the things that we're going to talk about next is feedback. Less obvious in the model of communication is noise. And noise, if you notice on the model, it's kind of those wavy lines that come down by the channel and by the message. Noise is anything that gets in the way of that message being communicated to the receiver. We can have external noise, which is noise within the environment. Perhaps there's a class, perhaps there's a lot of noise outside of a classroom. Perhaps you're talking with someone in a restaurant that's very loud. Perhaps you're trying to have a conversation with someone and the TV is on. So that's external noise, but there's also internal noise, things that are going on in your head, psychological noise, physical noise if you're hungry, if you're tired. All of those get in the way of our message. Feedback, I mentioned earlier, is what you are getting back. We are sending and receiving simultaneously. So it's what you're getting back from the people. For example, if I'm lecturing in class and I see that I'm getting confused looks from my students, it means that they're giving me feedback that they didn't quite understand what was being said. And last, under the less obvious, is the context. Context is where the communication event is physically happening. Could also be historical, what's happened between the two people in the relationship. Psychological, how people are feeling at that time as well. Okay, so hopefully today's online lecture gave you some ideas of what is interpersonal communication. So to review, the outcomes for this lecture were to define interpersonal communication, explain what it means to study communication, and then to be able to draw and explain the model of communication, including the model's components. Hopefully you found this online lecture enlightening, and hopefully it gave you a little more information about what is interpersonal communication.